without further ado, we will go back to one of those who turned their eyes towards politics as a means of resolving the conflict. And Etain, you might reflect on John Hume for us. Thanks.
Thank you, Dearbhail. So I'd like to thank Eleanor and Maeve very much for the idea for this event to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday and the civil rights marches, movements, and to thank them for their organisation and all the speakers as well who've been so great, and Dearbhail especially. Dearbhail and Paul are very hard acts to follow, but I'll do my best. Okay, just check this. Okay. So I'm going to talk about John Hume. Paul has already mentioned him, and then move it to the present, to what we learn more recently from the Brexit negotiations and in the light of John Hume's legacy. Say something very briefly about Bloody Sunday, because I think it's important, not just because we are marking it today to remember it, but also it says a lot about how British-Irish relations have actually improved, because I think with all the negativity about Brexit, we can still say they are better than they were, and we see such change if you compare now to then in terms of government responses and policies. I think Paul really has touched on this already, and I don't need to repeat it, that it was really a movement or movements to achieve civil rights equality, and my upbringing would have been to have modelled it very much in my head on the American influence of Martin Luther King, although Paul, I think, highlighted how there are divisions and different perceptions of that, and also the slide towards violence that occurred. In terms of Bloody Sunday itself, it was one of these marches which occurred on the 30th of January 1969 in the Bogside area of Derry, ostensibly or genuinely in opposition to internment being introduced, that sparked off a huge, I suppose, riot and the death of 14 victims. And many people probably have seen the footage that was recorded of that occurring, and how shocking it was to see people being killed when they were fleeing, and innocent people who were peacefully marching. And in terms of consciousness, I think a lot of a big factor in all of this is also the role of the media, which was only just probably becoming more general at that time, making it clear what was happening. And were killed by British soldiers, and that was again so shocking. Eventually, and there was the Widger report, which I can never pronounce it correctly, but in 2010, I think a very historic event, which I think should be noted, was the Saville report, and a very historic speech by the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, who I think we all now associate with the Brexit referendum, nothing else. It's like Tony Blair, I suppose, in the Iraq War, an analogy in some ways. But he apologised officially for Bloody Sunday, and that was a momentous event. And then, of course, we've the Queen's visit, which some of us were talking about over dinner, that the first time a British monarch visited Ireland occurred then soon after that in 2011. So it was in contrast to the approach of British governments that it shows the change that has occurred in British government's policy and approach to Northern Ireland through decades compared to the 60s and 70s, which is why I've mentioned it there, and something I think to remember again in the context of Brexit. As regards John Hume specifically in all this, because Paul has spoken really with great insight and first-hand knowledge of the civil rights movement, he was known or was regarded as being an innovative nationalist in the Northern Irish context at that time. As Paul said, he was the product of free education, and the generation of Northern Irish leaders reflected that and became leaders in a very thoughtful, insightful way. And where his innovation was, which seems so obvious to us now in the context of the Good Friday Agreement, but he argued and emphasised that you could both be a nationalist and yet accept Northern Ireland's status as part of the UK as a given. So it was a constitutional form of nationalism that didn't seek sudden, quick or violent change, but saw unification as a gradual process by consent, not to be forced upon any community, and which typified the conflict as a conflict of identities, not just territorial, but about identities. So he was highly innovative, and that thinking really went back to the 1950s, where he begins to develop those ideas. He also strongly emphasised the need for a democratic party to represent nationalists, and saw conflict in Northern Ireland, and I suppose more generally, as representing a failure of democracy and of legitimacy of democratic institutions. And he also emphasised mutual respect and, again, gradual change, that a united Ireland or any change does not occur through violence in a way, and occurs gradually. He was seen as a great parliamentarian in that way, in respecting the rights of a democracy, in trying to uphold those rights, and in valuing the role of parliaments and of democratic institutions in advancing political causes. And that was at every level. So the SDLP held its seats in Westminster. And in addition, in the European Parliament, he was seen as a very devoted and shrewd negotiator. He used the European institutions to advance his political strategy, and he did that extremely successfully. So as I said, he conceptualized the conflict as a clash of identities, and very gradually what emerged, and again quite early on this was in his thought, was the totality of the relationship, which was a term used in the 1980s, between Britain, Ireland and Northern Ireland, that the conflict was not just internal, because the traditional view of conflicts and of the Northern Irish conflict was very much an internal divide, very much typified as a religious war, as Paul said in the EU, that it was just between religions. But in fact, he emphasised it was much broader than that. It was about misrule, and it was about policy failures, not just from the British government, but also Irish governments he lobbied as well, and that the British-Irish intergovernmental, the internal relationship and the cross-border relationship all had to be dealt with and resolved successfully and institutionalised, which eventually became the Good Friday Agreement, and that framework of 3 strands and various dimensions to resolving conflict. The EU was central to his approach. He was, maybe obsessed is too strong a word, but maybe Paul could shed light on this, apparently genuinely devoted to the concept of Franco-German cooperation and what the EU had done for that, and thinking that was a model for Northern Ireland, and really wedded to that idea. And I said at another TRISS event that we had last term, how Mark Durkan, who became leader of the SDLP after him, said that John Hume wanted to really make the EU a bigger part of the Good Friday Agreement, because actually the EU is not mentioned very often in the Good Friday Agreement, and that someone said to him, John, you can't have chips with everything. So it was kind of reflecting how committed he was to that idea, and I would like to know why he wanted it too. Did he foresee any of these problems? Did he want the EU to be more involved? So culminated then in the Good Friday Agreement. It's very clear from various accounts and from even media accounts, UK and Irish membership of the EU was assumed. It was a given for the Good Friday Agreement, and as I said, that was central to John Hume's belief system and his thought, and how it also was central to the success of the British-Irish relationship. And again, that relationship was often, in the context of EU membership, seen as very successful, that the EU had helped it. As we've just been saying very briefly, that the UK and the Irish governments often had common interests economically. They could see each other without talking about the sore thumb of partition. They could talk about other issues. They could talk away from their constituencies, more privately and informally. So it was seen as a very central element. It also enshrined, or at least made more visible, Irish sovereignty as a state in its own, with sovereign powers, paradoxically. And I remember speaking to a British diplomat who had been in the EU from the 70s and said he very quickly saw a change in attitude among British diplomats and politicians towards the Irish government with EU membership, where they saw it very clearly as a separate state, because that hadn't really become embedded. Obviously, Brexit takes away that framework and has severely damaged it. So in terms of Hume's legacy, Brexit takes away a pillar of his thought and of his framework in a way that is really quite shocking, and I think we all feel that over the past few years, what we've seen. So lessons learnt from Hume and from Brexit and where we are now, to try and bring it together. From Hume, we see the power of intensive and long-term lobbying and a political strategy, where he really used every channel available, where he, which I didn't mention, courted US senior senators and politicians and got them on board to influence policy, which is depicted in Maurice Fitzpatrick's film last year, Hume in America, very successfully developing relationships with elite politicians, lobbying and getting their support, which was crucial at various times, which we saw in the Good Friday Agreement, the granting of visa, for example, to Gerry Adams, different decisions that were made that very much reflected a very close relationship. He influenced the Irish government, Department of Foreign Affairs. His thought permeates really the approach to conflict resolution that we see in the Irish government and eventually the British government, culminating in the Good Friday Agreement. The totality of relations, the three strands, the role of the EU, all these things emanate very much, it's wrong to be too reductionist, but very much from Hume's approach, and became policy through his long-term strategy, his lobbying of the EP as well. The role of the EU as central is a lesson we have learned, and it was successful. I'd argue it wasn't a cause of the peace process, but it oiled the wheels. It made it easier for unionists to cooperate at times and to engage in cross-border cooperation because the money was neutral. It was EU money. It wasn't Irish money. And also he emphasised strongly through the three strands, but the essential condition of British-Irish cooperation, of governments cooperating and having a strategy which would stand up to veto players. So the Sunningdale Agreement, for example, where Sunningdale Agreement's power sharing and the overall agreement collapsed in the face of unionist opposition from some unionists, not all. The lesson learned from that was that British and Irish governments needed to have a joint approach, a joint strategy, joined up thinking and stand firm in implementing a policy. And it's the culmination of that we see very much in the Good Friday Agreement, because that began in the 80s. Lessons about the EU through all this, we see its ability to, within Brexit, to form a coherent voice, even now with 27 states. The peace packages that were granted to Northern Ireland from the 90s at the time, and now if people were to pay attention to them, which probably they don't much, was a very strong example too of that coherence, because EU states agreed to divert funds specifically to Northern Ireland. It wasn't part of regional policy, it was a specific standalone package, and they agreed to divert that money at a time when enlargement was happening. So it was a relatively prosperous time, but at the same time enlargement was occurring. There was a need for funds, but they all stood behind this idea. So that coherence has been there a long time, and there was always an argument that if the EU got bigger, it would get weaker and it wouldn't have that coherence. That has not happened, even now with all these states. And we see that in the way, following Irish very intense lobbying as well, Irish governmental lobbying, they to this day support the backstop and refuse to renegotiate the withdrawal agreement, for example, and that is reflecting Irish preferences, but also they've made clear EU preferences on the importance of maintaining a soft border. We see the ability of the EU to empower small states, such as the Irish government, even though sovereignty is shared and pooled. We see how successful it has lobbied. But we see very clearly the absence of Northern Ireland from the UK's political agenda. And that comes out very clearly in the crisis of Brexit. That was very clear from the referendum time onwards, when Northern Ireland wasn't mentioned. And it's really only when the backstop became an issue that was reversed very much, and we see more references to Northern Ireland, more sensitivity to it coming from Theresa May really over the past 18 months. We see also the miscalculations of the UK government in all this, because I'm sure many of you would have seen various media accounts and various commentators and conservative politicians, some of them arguing that the EU will cave in on the backstop once the divorce bill is agreed. So once they get their money and their rebate, the backstop won't matter anymore. And that never happened. The backstop has remained a priority, and it's over that time, I think my feeling is the British government paid more attention to it. We also possibly, over looking at the whole period, can see Irish government miscalculations too. And by that, I suppose specifically, again, something we were talking about at dinner, is that really both governments took their eye off the ball as regards Northern Ireland once the peace process was a success, ostensibly. In many ways, of course it was. There was less attention paid to Northern Ireland and less emphasis. So that Brexit really has exposed a lot of those weaknesses. So some of the tensions, the rhetoric, the stereotypes we see now, I'd argue really reflect weaknesses which were there already and hadn't been addressed and have now just erupted again. So the problems were never fully gone. And one of the things that on a personal level and a political level would concern me is the ability of stereotypes to resurface so quickly, which again we were talking about at dinner briefly today. So the rhetoric has become very black and white very often about these issues and about each other in this context. On the Irish side, depiction of the British position as being imperial, or that the Brexit decision was an imperial one, harking back to when Britain was an empire. And then on the Irish side, this sort of depiction in the media of Leo Varadkar being this kind of young upstart causing a lot of trouble, and that really people are making a great deal of a fuss about the border when it can be dealt with quite sensibly in other ways. So we see those kind of stereotypes which would have been there in the past re-emerging, which I never heard in my lifetime, because I would have been a teenager really during, late old teenager in 1985, and things were improving. So I was not used to personally hearing some of the rhetoric that I had heard recently, and I found that very shocking and very upsetting. So while the picture and depiction of Bloody Sunday, which I mentioned, has gone, and thankfully and hopefully it will never come back, that kind of policy, hardline policy towards things, and while there's been such a strong and fruitful and rich relationship between Britain and Ireland, I think the re-emergence of stereotypes is worrying, and I think it's been managed very carefully by both governments. I think once it began, both Theresa May, Leo Varadkar, Simon Coveney have been very careful, I think, to dampen that. So yes, at the moment there are tensions, but that's being, I think, stated quite diplomatically. We also see the potential, of course, in Northern Ireland for sectarianism and polarisation to reignite. So the Brexit issue, because the majority of Catholics voted to stay in the EU, and the overall majority voted to stay, and then a majority of unionists voted to leave, but a significant proportion voted to stay as well. But nevertheless, since then, we see a huge polarisation in rhetoric and in language, which has brought the sectarian divide to the front again. And on top of that, there's no executive, which was not caused by Brexit, but Brexit has made things worse. So really, what's happened in the past 20 years is a short little snapshot of the total history of Ireland, Northern Ireland and Britain and the two islands. And therefore, these things are quite worrying to see them reignite so quickly. It shows that really what we see as embedded is probably not as embedded as we thought, the cooperation we thought was there. But we do see how, as I said, leaders have the ability, political leaders in both governments, to manage these tensions. And to a large degree, they have done so successfully. At times not, but in general, I would argue they have managed to dampen down the rhetoric. Individual party political leaders maybe not, or politicians, MPs and TDs at times, but the leaders of governments, of both governments, I would say, have been relatively, attempting and have succeeded in mollifying to an extent the extremes. So conclusion from civil rights to Brexit. Northern Ireland has been compared to an orphan child that no one wanted. Both governments really ignored it until the conflict occurred, and were quite happy to pay little attention to it after peace and the Good Friday Agreement. The UK's government was initially repressive to the conflict, and the conflict brought Northern Ireland to the centre of world attention. And then we see the blossoming and development of a very strong British-Irish relationship, which I'm not a comparativist, but I would say is very unique, the cultural ties between the islands, the fact that we did grow up with sort of television from the UK. There was a blending culturally, which I think is quite unusual. And we've relations, and all of us share relations in Britain and Ireland. All that intermeshing, it's been so hugely positive. However, the Brexit has really brought Northern Ireland back to the centre stage again, brought partition back to the centre stage again, and highlighted, as I said, some memories from the past, not as bad, but created some of those stereotypes again. And complacency, I would argue, has really been a huge problem. I should try and skip through this. I think it's too much, but I think overall we see the weaknesses in the relationship that have been highlighted. And overall, back to Hume, the threats to legitimacy by Brexit, where you have a substantial proportion of the Northern Irish population who want to stay in the EU, and you have polarisation, and you have internal politics, the DUP's position as well in Westminster. All of this highlights threats to legitimacy, which is dangerous. It's not at the moment an imminent threat, but it's something that should not develop any further. So thank you very much to everyone.
I don't know what it is about Northern Ireland and chips. John Hume has been told he couldn't have them for anything, and Sammy Wilson is telling us in the event of a no deal to go to the chipper. Really interesting. Etain, what I thought was interesting is that one of the things about the EU is that one of Hume's legacy is that one of the things the Irish government has been accused of is using the EU as a political strategy, but they certainly took the ball that John Hume started and ran with it. And one of the big things maybe you can keep to the wider discussion is on that issue of miscalculations and kind of the key point we're at, because in the one sense, if the DUP or sections of that community push the integrity of the union so far, it could actually contradictory in another way kind of lead as a catalyst to a debate for a united Ireland, perhaps, that they don't want, in the same way than the Irish government in its very, very firm position and understandable position to really stick with the backstop could, in the event of a no deal Brexit, actually create the one thing that they didn't do. So it's a really, really interesting idea, the notion of calculations. So we're on that